The U.S. and NATO rejected demands from Russia Wednesday during talks aimed at easing tensions in Eastern Europe. Russia wants to ensure Ukraine and other former Soviet nations are prevented from joining NATO. NATO backed the U.S., saying that demand is a non-starter. Despite the continued slow progress with this week's talks, NATO has left the door open to discuss other security issues like arms control and missile deployment. The U.S. and its NATO allies are hoping to de-escalate tensions after Moscow sent thousands of troops to its border with Ukraine. Russia continues to say it is not planning to invade, but will not commit to pulling back its troops, which the U.S. says makes diplomacy difficult. For more on the ongoing security talks, I want to bring in former U.S. Ambassador to NATO Kay Bailey Hutchison. She was also the first woman elected to represent Texas in the United States Senate. Ambassador, welcome. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you.
So there is a fundamental disagreement between the U.S. and NATO over Russia's demands to prohibit Ukraine and other former Soviet nations from being permitted to join NATO. What are the other areas of disagreement, and is NATO offering to de-escalate matters?
Oh, NATO is very much trying to de-escalate Russia's activities, but Russia is causing this. Anytime you find 100,000 troops on the border of another country, that gives you pause, of course. And the Ukraine people are very concerned about this. Russia has already invaded Crimea in 2014, which is a part of Ukraine. And now, of course, we are all very united. And the meeting today has a very united NATO saying to Russia, back off of Ukraine and stop this malign activity.
Well, yes, the U.S. and other European countries are standing by their pledge to support Ukraine's sovereignty. If Russia continues to refuse to back off Ukraine, though, what might the U.S. be willing to do to demonstrate what President Biden calls America's, quote, unwavering support for Ukraine?
I think what's really being discussed now with all of our allies is an economic sanction that would cripple Russia's economy, which no one wants to do. But if Russia continues this aggressive activity against another sovereign nation that is a partner of NATO, they're not in the alliance, but they are a formal partner. And we want free people, such as Ukrainians are, to have the ability to decide their own fate. So Russia said they wanted a commitment that NATO would not accept Ukraine as a member. Well, that's a non-starter. If Ukraine wants to be a member and they meet the criteria for NATO, then the NATO allies will make that decision. And we are very supportive of Ukraine and want them to meet the guidelines that are necessary to be a part of the NATO alliance. So I think we will be able to talk to Russia about arms control. There are certainly missile issues that could have some discussion. And most certainly, the activities of Russia trying to tell NATO where the borders of NATO are will never, ever happen.
On this notion of sanctions, you mentioned Crimea earlier. Well, this morning, Senate Democrats unveiled a new bill that would impose sanctions on top Russian military and government officials. As you know, the U.S. imposed a number of sanctions after Russia forcibly annexed part of Ukraine in 2014. And since then, Russia has only ramped up election interference and cyber hacking. So are sanctions against Russia in this moment, you think, particularly effective?
I think if we go the next step in sanctions, that it could be effective. For one thing, we could shut Russia out of the monetary system that includes the dollar monetary systems, which means that there would be a real collapse in their economy if they couldn't have trade in currency. But secondly, we are very concerned, have been a long time. All the other Europeans besides Germany are very concerned about Nord Stream 2 and giving Russia more income from gas lines into Germany through Nord Stream 2. And we would hope that Germany, which has paused or Nord Stream 2, would be willing to cancel Nord Stream 2, because we do not want to fund the malign activities and the cyber activities of Russia. The third thing that could be done is more effective cyber. When Russia condones cyber activity against any of our countries, that we would be more forceful in attacking some of their infrastructure, so that they would know that we are being that we're serious.
Well, is there a point you foresee, Ambassador, where potentially the U.S. might acknowledge that Russia is not acting in good faith? And how might that change the Biden administration's course of action?
Well, I think we have a consensus that Russia is not acting in good faith. I think what they're doing with Ukraine, what they have already done with Ukraine, shows they're not acting in good faith. And what they're doing in Kazakhstan, what they're doing in Moldova, Belarus, they are Syria as well. They're in a lot of countries fomenting malign activity, fomenting dissidents. And it is time that we talk to Russia, which we did today, which the U.S. did on Monday, which is going to happen again tomorrow at the OSCE. We are trying to engage Russia, but that's a two-way street. And if Russia is going to continue the malign activities, they're clearly testing us to see if we will actually do anything when they cross the line of sovereign countries and when they involve themselves in the domestic politics of other countries like Kazakhstan or Syria. So I think that we have to show strength. And right now, I think we are being tested by Russia, and we need to react with resolve.
I wonder, Ambassador, if you think there may be a connection between the assessment Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, is making of America's strength right now, given the political discord that we are seeing domestically.
Well, I think that several things have caused our adversaries to question our resolve. And one was the whole situation in Afghanistan, where we saw just a debacle, and that has caused our adversaries not to fear us. We want to be trusted by our allies and feared by our adversaries, and we have to show that we will have the resolve to do what we say we're going to do and to follow through. And I certainly think that Russia is testing us now, and I hope that the unity of NATO, which I know happened today at that meeting, every one of our allies spoke very clearly about what Russia is doing and that it was unacceptable, and that these ultimatums that they are giving are non-starters. All of that was done today. But I think we have to back that up with serious consequences if Russia doesn't back off. And I personally believe that it's time to do something that says we're not going to make any concessions. We're not going to do anything more with Russia until we see retreat of the 100,000 troops that are now on the border with Ukraine.
Ambassador Kay Bailey Hutchison, thanks very much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you.